Hello and welcome to today's video, where we're going to take an idea from an initial sketch, 3D model it, print it, and then paint it. I'm a part of a few Patreon monthly subscriptions, and after seeing this month's release from Naga Minis, specifically this little guy, I instantly knew I had to find some way of having him on my shelf. Cue the process of terrible sketching, as well as grabbing a few of the familiar looking beasts from other Patreons, and we're on our way to a very weird and rough looking sketch plan of what we could end up with. I already have a frame which I can build the diorama into, so we're going to start our 3D modelling journey in Blender by creating the frame and the dimensions of which we can fit our model into. We're going to start with a basic cube, hollow out the middle, and then take the top face and use that as the starting point for the initial block out. Next thing to do is to grab the models into the scene for a sense of perspective and positioning. Using that initial sketch as a very rough guide, we can start to see this thing coming together. We can then start building out the primitives, taking the basic blocks and crafting them into a rough shape that we need. Starting with a cube, we can then use the bisect tool to cut the sharp corners and start to get a cavey rock entrance. And then following that, use the knife tool, we can cut out a basic path shape and extrude that up to help us define that from the grass. Next is a fence, made up of extruded or scaled cubes, followed on by a very basic mailbox that ends up getting replaced later on in the process. Finally, for this stage, we can add some small spheres, smush them together into a head-shaped object and position them into place. Now we have the basic block out for most of the elements, we can start adding details and textures into the model to really help make the painting a lot easier later on. Starting with the cave house, we first cut out an entrance for the doorway using a boolean operation, and then take the object into sculpt mode, where we can grab some of the corners to make it a little more organic, smooth out some of the rough edges, and then add some texture. Here I rely on a technique that you'll see me using throughout the model, adding texture using a sculpting brush and an image texture. For this one we use an anchored brush and an alp of a rock face, but there is also the option of using a seamless pattern and just colouring in the surface. After that we move on to modelling a basic door, add that onto the front of the house, and then finally we cut some holes out using that same boolean operation so we can see the inside of the house. More on that later on. And now it's a case of going around the model following that same process of smoothing the mesh, adding some detail, and then painting on the textures. Starting with the grass lawn and then the path, then onto the hedges, and finally the fence at the front of the garden. Getting back to the mailbox, I decided I didn't like the initial one, so went online and found a few reference images of an old American style mailbox, the ones with the little red flag on the side, and used that as a guide to remodel. There's a part of me that feels like I'm cheating when I do this, but actually the more I think about it, the more I realise it's an important part of building up our visual memory bank of everything we need to make interesting items that people actually recognise. After thinking about how I wanted the final piece to look, along with some of the electronics that I wanted to pop in, I decided the front garden needed a final element, a street lamp. This time I started with the reference image, creating a post hollowed out for wiring, which in hindsight should have been much bigger, and then a top housing for the light bulb. I left the glass out, with a plan to add some coloured acetate later on to give it a coloured glow for the build. Now the model is complete, we can export it into the slicing program, I use Chitubox, and then get it ready for printing. Now 3D printing as a process could have multiple videos all on its own, so if you've got any questions either around exporting, supporting or slicing, let me know down in the comments and I'll do my best to try and answer them. After the initial print, we need to clean the remaining resin off using isopropyl alcohol, and then do one final cure under UV light to seal the model. Because I didn't plan ahead as much as I probably should have done, I needed to do some minor modifications to the base, including carving out the path where it overlapped with the cave house and drilling a hole for the wiring to come through for the lamp. Now be careful, resin dust can be nasty, so I made sure I wore all the correct safety gear here when doing this, as a lot of particles can get kicked out. Next, I took all the items over to my airbrush booth and primed them. Starting with black as a base coat, I then applied a zenithal highlight from the top of the models. My favourite way to paint is with transparent paints, either thin acrylics or more dedicated contrast and speed paints, and using them over a zenithal like this is relatively simple and it gets great results with a lot of definition, especially where we applied all that texture during the modelling section. From this black and white base, we can then start to lay down the base tones. I start out with a slightly muted green here across the grass and hedges, before coming back in with a stronger green to add some variation and depth, which seemed to work out quite well. The more finely detailed elements got hand painted with the transparent paints I mentioned earlier, starting with the brown wooden door on the cave house, the fence posts and the lamp post pole, and then slightly more detailing onto the mailbox and the lamp top itself. From there, we add some deep purple to our monster, and then a variety of colours to the small Snail postman, hopefully to make him pop. After allowing those base coats to dry, I went in and picked out some of the even finer details with contrasting colours to help them stand out, such as his scarf, eyes, and the logo on their hats. We are getting there, final few steps to get across the line. Something new I've been playing around with is installing lights into builds, so now comes the time for some awkward soldering. I have two types of LED bulb, one that flickers and one that's just a constant light. However, because I end up soldering them into one battery circuit, I ended up with two flickering LEDs, presumably as one of them affects the power getting to the other. I'm sure someone with a lot better knowledge of electrics can explain why in the comments below. Quick tip: when looking to add wires into a build, make sure you leave enough room, both for the top of the bulb and the lamp, and also for the wires throughout the pole, or you may have to end up hand drilling out a very fragile resin pole, and trust me, no one wants to do that. Once the soldering was done, a quick lighting test, and we're on to final assembly. Thanks to the basic layout we had, the final assembly was relatively smooth, at least compared to the wiring stage. I just used basic super glue, or CA glue for our American friends, and that seems to have held everything just fine, and this shouldn't be taking too much abuse as it sits on the shelf and isn't played with constantly. Final dust off, leave it all to dry, and we can call it done and see what we ended up with. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how this turned out, and I learnt a lot along the way. Hopefully you enjoyed coming along for the ride as well and seeing the process, and if you have any questions or ideas of what kind of a build I should be doing next, let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please do all the YouTube things and help it spread. I'd love to be doing more of these in the future. That's it from me. Have a great day and hope to speak to you all again soon.